When the nervous system starts to calm down or we start to rest, then our brain sometimes perceives that as a threat, and then it goes back to familiar chaos because that's what we know all the time.
What if the secret to better sleep isn't just in what you do at bedtime, but how you heal, process, and connect with yourself and with others during the day?
Just because you have a big emotional reaction to something doesn't mean it's factual.
Thinking about what you're saying here and going, how do I help that person at 2 a.m.?
Hello and welcome to Sleep is My Waking Passion, the podcast where we get real about sleep and how it shapes your life. I'm Dr. Allison Cole, a triple-boarded pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine physician who's learned to thrive despite having chronic insomnia. And now I'm here to help you do the same.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new season of the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast. And I want to start off this episode by asking you a question. What if the secret to better sleep isn't just in what you do at bedtime, but how you heal, process, and connect with yourself and with others during the day? That is the question. So today on the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast, we're diving straight into the world of integrative psychotherapy. And we're going to explore modalities that go way beyond just classic talk therapy. And I really want you to think about this episode as a way for you to learn that there are actually therapies that are adjunctive or in addition to standard cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia that can complement that CBT-I approach for people who have real trouble sleeping. So if you fit into that chronic insomnia category, and all of my listeners know that I do, stick around because my guest is really special today. So I have Mr. Anthony Fontana. He is an AMFT and APCC. He happens to be a holistic psychotherapist, and he has expertise in a wide range of psychotherapies that can translate to help you have some better sleep. And we're going to kind of go over some of those therapies today. So if you've ever wished your racing mind and tense body could finally relax, and you're curious about how cutting-edge trauma therapies that include EMDR or TRE, stick around so you can find out what those are. These therapies may actually help you sleep. And today, we're going to go over this, so I want you to stay tuned to learn all about it. Welcome, Anthony. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I didn't get a chance to brag about you a little bit. So by the way, Anthony holds a master's in clinical psychology. He specializes in marriage and family therapy from Pepperdine University, and then a bachelor's in drama with a focus on musical theater at UC Irvine. So you have a wide range of life lived, if you will, before you got into psychotherapy. That's so cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. Many lives prior to becoming a psychotherapist, which I feel definitely informed me when I'm able to be across from a client. Yeah, I had a long passion for psychology in general, and I almost actually studied that in undergrad, but at the time I wanted to pursue acting and performance and went to school for music theater, kind of learning how to embody a character and understanding psychology from the other side, and worked in that business for quite a long time. In casting, music directing, vocal coaching, being a performer myself, as well as a talent representative, talent agent, and manager. And then a little after COVID, I decided to make the switch, and I was like, okay, I kind of want to do something new. I found myself always helping people in many different ways, especially as a vocal coach and a talent manager. And I was like, I want to take this to the next level. And I found yoga, and then I ended up deciding to become a therapist because I had met so many people in the yoga community who are also psychotherapists as well. And I had started my therapy journey around that time too, and it totally transformed and changed my life. So here I am many years later.
I love that we're talking about this because I have been yearning to find someone that I think would take me to the next level in terms of therapy. And I just find in Jersey, I have not been all that pleased with some of the people I've interacted with. And I think that sometimes can be one of those things that can be really hard. So if you know anybody at Oak Health Center that is taking Jersey clients, I want to know about them because I really trust the organization, and that's why I work with them to try to help all of your incredibly complex patients sleep better from the medical perspective, but also incorporating some of that cognitive behavioral therapy that we're talking about. So you have several areas of expertise, and I'm going to start kind of by wanting to talk to you a little bit more about dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, solution-focused narrative therapy, and then lastly, emotionally focused therapy. There is some data for some of these modalities to help with sleep, but first, what the heck are these? Because I had to do this whole search and I was like, I'm not even sure I can explain it well. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Maybe we can start with dialectical behavioral therapy. What is that and who would it apply to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and actually, I'll probably start with CBT because there's a pathway that this goes and it'll be better explained, I think, through that way. So back in the original days, I think most people who are familiar with psychology understand this idea of Pavlov training the dog to salivate at the bell and all that stuff. And so psychology kind of started in addition to Freud and Carl Jung's work of psychoanalysis. It started to move into this idea of behavioral therapy. Beginning of behavioral therapy was kind of, these rewards, punishments, these stimuli, triggers, and then a response that we all have innately within us. And then that was kind of the first wave of behavioral therapies. And later on came the idea of our cognitions. So our thoughts, our emotions, our behavior all impact each other. And at the center, there's these core beliefs. And that's kind of what cognitive behavior therapy started to become, is how do we have these core beliefs that are set up at a very young age, at a developmental part of who we are. And we're taught, and this is kind of where narrative therapy will come in later on down the road. But the stories that we're told about ourselves, we start to believe, and those become an integral part of our identity. And then those will then translate into our thoughts, and our thoughts will then start to change into emotions. Emotions will change into behavior. And then they all start to bilaterally affect each other. And then the third wave of behavioral psychology, it started to get into more of the Eastern philosophies. So like Eastern medicine, similar to like yoga, Buddhism, and like all of this other Eastern side of the world. And so that's where dialectical behavior therapy started to come into play, and acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT. I know in psychology we have all these acronyms, and so it's always confusing as to what these are. Dialectical behavior therapy specifically was a therapy that was created by somebody named Marsha Linehan, and it's again, kind of a third wave of CBT. So at the base, it has CBT in it. And as you start to move through the traditional way of doing DBT, you start to see the CBT influence within this. But it was originally created for clients with high suicidality and eventually borderline personality disorder. And it is one of the most effective treatments for those kinds of disorders. And it's also branched out, like a lot of other therapies, into helping people with just anxiety or depression or insomnia and all of this stuff. And the really cool thing about DBT is it's a skills-based training or therapy. So it is a little bit more like teacher-student kind of therapy, but traditional DBT will have its individual therapy in like once a week. And then they'll have like 3 group classes that they're going through 4 different modules, which is mindfulness is one, emotion regulation is the next, then there's distress tolerance, and then there is interpersonal effectiveness skills. But it always starts with mindfulness, because mindfulness is kind of the crux of all of these other skills. Because if we're not present, how are we able to then know what our emotions are saying to us, or how we can start checking the facts, or noticing what's within ourselves, so that way we can then say, oh, I'm in distress right now. I can use the tip skill or the stop skill or any of these skills that are kind of embodied into the modality. But I think a big part of DBT that is really impactful in the mindfulness section, a lot of people think that mindfulness is just meditation. And obviously it's a lot more than that. Like meditation, I think, is the basis of it, but there's walking meditation, and we can start to talk a little bit about all these different kinds of meditations like Vipassana and other things like that. But it has this idea that we have 2 states of mind, and then we have what's called the wise mind in the middle. And it kind of borrows the idea of the higher self, or that there's something greater, like our intuition, that's within us, that every one of us have this inner wisdom within us. But we have 2 sides of the mind, and Marsha Linehan kind of breaks this down into the emotion side, which is kind of hot. It's ruled by emotions. It's, impulsive. And then we have a reasonable mind, which is logic based. It's more focused on facts and all of that stuff. And it's more cool. And being on either side of this polarity ends up being detrimental, right? And so it's about finding the balance, or that yin and yang harmonic balance, 2 halves of a whole that have to coexist. And then she has another principle that's kind of built off of that, which is the doer mind versus the being mind. And that idea is like doer is so goal-oriented and so task-focused that we're always kind of trying to be like the hamster on the wheel, go, 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 and achieve things. And then being is more just, I'm in the present moment. I'm totally focused on the here and now, which is where life happens, right? But most of us spend a lot of time in the future or the past worrying about things that happen, and then we miss out on the moment. So that's kind of what DBT is. And it's also the word dialectic is holding two things that could be opposing as true at the same time. And that's really hard for a lot of people sometimes as well.
And just to kind of link that, because it reminds me of a lot of the neuroscience that I've been studying as of late, there is an actual physiologic basis. This isn't some theoretical construct. We literally have different parts of our brain that have different functionings, and we have these emotional parts of our brain, and being able to marry those emotional parts of our brain with the more logical side of our brain. And that's kind of what I'm hearing you say. Like, I'm marrying it with my idea of where these specific centers are in the brain, and finding a way to not just be purely on, right-sided brain or left-sided brain, so to speak. But I think we're kind of speaking the same language, just talking about it slightly differently. Yeah. So I just wanted to highlight that for the listener who may be more anatomically minded and thinking, well, this sounds like woo-woo and voodoo, but really it's based in neuroscience. This is how our brain operates, because this is how we evolved evolutionarily. And so being able to come to grips with that in 2025, I think is really, really nice that we're being able to talk about it. And I think what you point out is we need to create these constructs just because of how our brain tends to want to create organization around something that otherwise seems a little bit chaotic and disjointed to think about. If you want to compartmentalize it into different parts of the brain, go right ahead. That may be helping you think about it. But I think we're really speaking apples to apples, though it may sometimes not come across that way. So I just wanted to clarify that for any of our folks that see psychology and science as being different, because I don't. I see the connection there, and I may not be able to wax as eloquent as I'd like about how to make those connections per se, but so I want to move on now and talk a little bit about acceptance and commitment therapy, and how does that play along with the DBT that you were just describing?
Absolutely. And a lot of therapists end up, again, not co-regulating this, but they'll complement each other very well. What I usually do is I'll find a mixture of all three. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the reason why I've dived into a lot of the different works that I've done is doing my own therapy, and also studying therapy or psychology in general is, each and every one of us is unique. And kind of what you're alluding to, Dr. Allison, is this idea that, our brains are all different. Like, we grow up differently. And as we start to dive into more the somatic and the understanding of the nervous system, like, we'll kind of go into like different parts of the brain, what they do and what they're responsible for. But at the end of the day, like, it's not a cookie cutter approach. Like, what might help you might be different than what helps me and somebody else. And so I personally really like to blend all of these together. But ACT or acceptance commitment therapy kind of builds upon that idea of what DBT does. But it's more of this idea of, there's this principle in dialectical behavior therapy called radical acceptance. And that's kind of what ACT is based off of. And again, it kind of comes from this Eastern idea of, if anyone's familiar with Dr. Joe Dispenza's work, which he's done a lot of neuroscience and understanding of the brain and the mind and how it works in the subconscious, there's this idea that we're the consciousness behind the mind, if you will, and that there's to be the outside observer. And a lot of what ACT is kind of accepting that our mind is always going to be telling us a story, that our mind is telling us something. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And I think that a lot of times people, especially when I introduce DBT to them, this is kind of like a big light bulb moment for them, where it's like, just because you have a big emotional reaction to something doesn't mean it's factual, right? And just because I have a thought about something doesn't mean that it's rooted in fact. And ACT really starts to create this idea similar to narrative therapy, where we're externalizing ourself as the person from the problem, is that my mind is here and then I am me, right? And so there's this idea that sometimes we fuse all of these cognitions into beliefs about ourselves or about the world around us, and ACT starts to kind of diffuse those a little bit to be like, these aren't absolutes about who we are. So a big part of ACT is also accepting our experience as it is, because we can't change anything that we can't own. So a big part of that is like, if I'm feeling anxious right now, rather than trying to push it away, is kind of welcoming that and be like, what is my anxiety trying to say? Or what is it trying to show me? Or how can I befriend this because it's a signal that something might be wrong? Right. And as an example, if, let's say, you go to a bar and some creepy guy is next to you and, he starts hitting on you and you're like, wait, I'm anxious right now. Like, that's a primal signal from your nervous system to say, okay, something's not right here. Right. So I think part of that is like accepting that our nervous system has these responses that happen and then being okay with these. once we understand the why behind we're feeling a certain way, and we can accept where we are in the moment. And again, kind of comes back to presence work of being here and now, right here where life happens, then we could start to move and, befriend it and then change it. So that way it's not always ruling our life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it really does make sense. I'm curious what was going on in the back of my mind as I'm thinking, one of the things that happens at that witching hour, that like 2 to 4 a.m.,
Yes.
right? I have all these patients that wake up and I've been guilty of it too. And especially if it's happening on multiple nights and repeatedly, then you're kind of throwing sleep deprivation onto it. And we have all of these thoughts and they're not all real. And I always try to remember to encourage my patients to know that when you have the kooky, random, usually not pleasant or positive thought that doesn't make you feel all warm and cuddly, but then promotes the anxiety, I need to do stuff tomorrow. What am I going to do? I'm not sleeping, right? In that realm, what I've been telling them is that those thoughts are just your mind, that sleep deprived mind that's going to promote more of this negative and anxious thinking because you have less regulation of certain parts of your brain that help you regulate your emotions. You're going to lean toward things that are more unpleasant. And I'm just thinking about what you're saying here and going, how do I help that person at 2 a.m.? Maybe that's another therapy that we haven't yet covered, but it just made me think of that. And I was like, wow, what can we do when that happens? Recognizing that, yes, our emotions are real at that moment, but they may not really be real in the sense of our brain's not firing on all cylinders either.
Yes, absolutely. And I think obviously during that time, right, a lot of people do wake up between that 2 to 4 time. I know historically they call it the witching hour, and there might be some psycho-spiritual thing associated with that, But I think that there's another part of this that is, yes, our mind is always telling us a story. It doesn't always mean it's true. But I think from narrative therapy, a beautiful reframe that one of my clients and I went over one time is similar. There were these thoughts that were keeping the client up at night and all of this stuff. And, I think that when we do that, it means that we genuinely care. So shifting the narrative in your mind to, oh, something's wrong with me, I can't sleep, all of this stuff too. My mind is showing me that this is important to me. This thing is important to me, whatever it is that I'm stressing out about, and starting to recognize that it's, again, playing a role into that. Now, the question then becomes, how do we start to quiet the mind so we can get back into that rest and digest system, right? And that's kind of where some of these other somatic modalities or meditation starts to come in, especially with TRE, trauma and tension release exercises, which I know we'll start to talk about as well. But from the idea of a basic nervous system structure is, we have our fight or flight response, which is our sympathetic arousal or hypoarousal. And then we have the freeze or the fawning response, which is more of that dorsal vagal response, the down-regulated part of our nervous system, and we can get stuck in those. And so as we're kind of talking about the brain, the amygdala is responsible for, the primal part of keeping us safe, keeping us alive. It's that fight or flight within us. And when trauma happens to us over and over and over, especially complex trauma, and on that note, I think it's important to define what trauma is, because a lot of people think that trauma could be this big thing like a car accident or the death in the family or something. But really what they've started to find is trauma is just the perception of a life-threatening event, right? And so somebody could scream at you and I, and we might be like, okay, that guy's having a bad day. But if somebody screams at a 5-year-old, that baby could be like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. And then that's ingrained in them, and then we have all of these triggers and things that get coupled together because our brain is always trying to process what's going on and trying to make sense of it. And so part of this is when we live in the amygdala and that fight or flight all of the time, and we don't do more somatic modalities to heal, the nervous system itself, then we can't really shift into more of the adult brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. And in similar ways like DBT, that's our wise mind, right? When we're an emotion mind, a lot of times we're in the amygdala. And so when we can kind of come into the idea of being in the prefrontal cortex, it's a lot easier for us to be able to then show up in a way that's more rational or more logical and also balanced. Done studies on this with meditators, and they've taken studies with people who haven't ever meditated before. And they took them through, I believe it was a 2-month process, and they brain scanned their amygdalas in their brain before. And what they found is that there was actually more activity after these people started to learn to meditate, even if it was just 15 minutes a day over that 2-month course of that study is their prefrontal cortex started to turn on more. And so they started to find that there was a direct correlation between breath, between focusing and steadying our mind, and then the prefrontal cortex starting to turn on more than the amygdala. And so it's part of this is starting to how do we get, again, out of that doer mind versus more into this beer mind or this wise-minded balance state as well. So, kind of a longer answer to your question, but, to get into how do we stop these racing thoughts is a lot of this is our nervous system gets stuck into these patterns of go, 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 or fight or flight. And then we don't know any better because we're just the hamster on the wheel. And then when the nervous system starts to calm down or we start to rest, then our brain sometimes perceives that as a threat. And then it goes back to familiar chaos because that's what we know all the time. So if somebody's constantly on the go during that time where they have nothing and everything's quiet, those racing thoughts can start to come in sometimes because the brain perceives the rest almost as this like threat to the nervous system because it's not used to it. And so part of that is then shifting, and over time, then it starts to be a little bit easier to sit in stillness.
I got to tell you, this is like hitting on some pain points within myself, because when you talk about trauma, it was difficult having a lot of really super sick patients and kind of feeling like I wasn't able to care for them in the way that I would normally like to care for my ICU patients. It was really sort of trauma in the sense of lots and lots of bodies getting really sick. And we were just putting Band-Aids on everyone and doing what we can during the pandemic. And that in and of itself, I think, is a form of trauma that, Absolutely. And I'm sort of interested in that because I think there's a lot of healthcare workers, myself included, who may need to kind of start to own that trauma a little bit and define it a little bit. And it, nobody tried to come after me or anything like that. But when you're used to kind of being able to predict what's going to happen in even really difficult situations, kind of know. And then we were having, we didn't know that these people were clotting and you'd be fine. You'd be on the phone with their family and explaining this, and then they're coding the next minute. And, you don't forget those experiences, and being able to kind of lean into that and, work through it. What was also, I think, I see it a lot in healthcare workers is, especially if you're kind of in the sector that I was in terms of medicine, which is pulmonary and ICU and everything. I was so used to medicines telling you, see more patients, also answer all of your task buckets. Take this phone call, do prior authorizations. By the way, you're now getting called up because there's an emergency on the 3rd floor that you need to manage. Oh, the hospital's calling you. You got to go back to the hospital. And all these things, all this multitasking and stuff that we got good. I use that in air quotes because, you can do it, but it slowly kind of strips away what you're feeling inside, and kind of strips away the joy of why we went into medicine in the first place. And I really relate to the idea of this hamster on the wheel thing, because as I started to recognize that this was no longer serving me, and that it was really important for me to kind of put myself ahead of everyone else, it also became very scary to think of, what does that look like in real life? Like, what does that look like for paying bills? What does that look like? How are other people going to perceive me that I did that, right? Am I going to be looked down upon? Am I going to have people that don't like me as a result of that? How does that make me feel? And then it became like, snap. Well, some of the reasons that I was perpetuating my behavior was specifically because I didn't want to disappoint people. I felt like I had to meet some standard or some bar. And then when I took a step back, and then I really did have more time on my hands, I renovated a shore house property and I did these other things. And what I'm recognizing now is, because I see it as I start to ramp up again a little bit with where my career is now kind of taking off a little bit now, and there's more opportunities, I became okay with not being that hamster on the wheel, but I had been it for so long that feeling, just as you describe, of being able to step away, I was like, it still feels uncomfortable. And I actually think I actively have to kind of talk myself out of, well, I could do that. I could fit that in. It's just one more thing. Yep. Right. And I'm just relating to the fact that the past couple of weeks have been so crazy for me, and I've been kind of working later days and making sure I'm making time for the kids and everything. Because even though I'm working from home now, I'm not, driving back from the hospital. I have this tendency, and there's got to be a lot of people listening who go, oh my goodness, if you're a type A go-getter, you want to be successful, you want to have that family life, you want to have it all. What do we do about it? what we need to do is start to learn about these therapies and actually start to incorporate them. And we don't have enough therapists to go around for each one of us to have one, I guess.
Right.
But what do we do? What's the solution here? I don't know.
Yeah. I think I was jokingly saying you're speaking my language because I've been the same way. It's like, I think when we live in that for so long, and I also want to name vicarious trauma is a real thing, right? And obviously, thank you so much for all the work that you did during COVID. I can only imagine how difficult that was. And, like you said, how confusing that was to go from thinking somebody is okay in one moment to then all of a sudden you're like, what is going on? And you guys are in some ways just having to go and never processing things, right? And Peter Levine, who's the founder of Somatic Experiencing, he has this idea of, he uses this ball or sometimes a slinky to explain this. But when trauma happens, rather than having expansiveness, everything kind of gets stuck. And everything kind of shrinks. And a lot of what somatic experiencing starts to do is we take those moments where we had trauma, where our nervous system didn't get to process anything, and we slowly start to unfold and open that up a little bit. And then what happens is the nervous system then collapses again. And then we slowly start to open it again. And then it comes back. And then eventually there's this expansiveness, right? And so as an example, when my grandma had passed away a couple of years ago, there were just all of these moments where I didn't really process what happened until, I want to say honestly, about a month ago when I was doing one of my somatic experiencing trainings. I'm finishing my intermediate year. It's a 3-year certification for somatic experiencing. And one of the things that we realize is that when we're having to go about life and just go, we don't have time to process all of this stuff. And so what Peter Levine had found, and similar in David Berceli's work with trauma and tension release, is our nervous system, what happens is when we don't get to complete. So our nervous system has this primal activation, deactivation cycle that it will go through. And animals in the wild don't usually get trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder because they're able to escape or they're able to fawn or do something else. And then what happens after they've escaped the threat is their body, their nervous system has a normal mechanism, which is called a neurogenic tremor. And their body will start to shake it off. And so similar, anybody recalls being cold in, the winter or anything like that, your body starts to shake and shiver. Or if you've ever experienced a car accident or been through, really bad breakup or something traumatic, your body sometimes will start to shake. And sometimes people perceive that as, oh my God, what's going on, right? Rather than kind of welcoming that and letting the process happen, because that's the system saying, oh, it's overregulated. And I need to go ahead and try to find a way back to homeostasis. And what happens a lot of the time as human beings is our ego mind or our egoic mind gets in the way. And that's the part that tries to keep us in survival, and it stops. Or how many times, if you think about people who have gotten in car accidents, they're like, oh, I have to get to work. And so they never allow themselves to really feel, okay, letting my body rest, processing what happened and all of this stuff. And it's in a lot of Peter Levine's work, it's about slowing everything down. And I've seen demos of him working with even people who were in the war who, there was this guy I remember recalling that he had worked with where he had a tic and they thought that he might have had Tourette's. And so the doctors diagnosed him with Tourette's, and Peter had worked with him because this guy had tried everything. And he found out about Peter's work and he said, I'm going to try some somatic experiencing. And Peter worked with him only for 8 sessions. And they slowed that whole point down of when the tic would come in. And what they found was the reason his body was doing it was always over the left shoulder. His head would always turn a certain way, is he didn't get to look and see when the bomb went off during the war. And that was his nervous system trying to complete what he didn't get to do in that moment. And so by slowing everything down, his nervous system, there was a discharge of heat into his arm. And then eventually over those first 4 sessions, the tic pretty much completely went away. And it was a really powerful thing to see. But a lot of what somatic experiencing is slowing everything down and giving yourself time to process. When I was going through that with just kind of reworking my grandma's death, we just slowed each moment down. And it was what was it like in that moment to realize that this was it? And I didn't have that in that moment. And so allowing my system to feel the grief of that. And then to give her permission and say it's okay to go. right now. And holding her hand through that process is everything happened so quick that my nervous system didn't have time to complete it and understand. But when we slow everything down, then our nervous system can go through that activation deactivation cycle. Because as we know, when you have kids or, you just have to be, in a high volume job and you're working, is you don't have time sometimes to think, especially if you work in the ER. You're just going a mile a minute because you just have to. And I do work with a lot of doctors as well, people with, high functioning jobs. And that's a big thing, is how do we learn how to slow down? How do we learn how to start making space and allowing ourselves to take up space? We obviously live in a society that's just very much goal oriented, especially in the United States. It's go, 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 go. We always have to keep up with the Joneses or something else. So I think a lot of this is giving yourself permission to slow down. But then it's hard because, like you're saying, I know for me, when I've slowed down, I will start to go, oh, everything's calm. And then our nervous system, when we've lived in that amygdala for so long, that fight or flight, it goes, oh, I should create something, to freak out about, or, oh, let me go cause, stir the pot, if you will. And so like you're saying, you kind of have to talk yourself out of those things and remind yourself, no, I'm safe right now. It's fine. I deserve to have peace. I deserve to be in a state of being, because that's our natural essence. We're a human being rather than a human doer. So I think a lot of this, what I found is the key that I think transforms a lot for people is this somatic idea. And for our listeners, it's the word soma in Greek means body. So that's where the idea of somatic comes from. I guess similar in an Eastern way, like the yogis kind of talked about this idea of, you have breath work, which is your pranayama. So prana in Sanskrit is the word for chi or life force or breath, right? And then you had your physical practice. So your asana that you would do, which was the physical postures of yoga. And then you would blend kind of breath and movement together. Then you would sit in stillness. But they realized that you have an energy body, a physical body, a mental body, emotional body, and then a spiritual body, if you will, for those who buy into that idea. But that there's multifaceted beings. And so part of this is we have to kind of look at the bigger picture. And, this is our vessel. We live in the body. And for a lot of people, it never feels like home. But this is home, right? And so it's learning how to slow everything down. And a lot of what I do as a somatic therapist, and especially in somatic experiencing, is when I'm working with a client, is I'm always trying to find what is the thing that they didn't get to complete. What is the thing that they didn't get to say? And it could be something as simple as somebody being a people pleaser and never being able to hold a boundary down. And so in session, we work, what is it like for you to say no? And to practice that with me right here in that moment. And what if I got a little closer? How does that show up in your system? Oh, I get anxiety. I get tightness in my chest, all of this stuff. And so, okay, what is it like for you to exercise that and say, get back right now? I don't need you to be there. And being able to, in some ways, take your power back, which is a beautiful thing to see when clients are able to be fully embodied and they just get out of their mind and into their heart space. And then there's that connection and that unity of body, mind, and spirit, and then they're way more full. They're way more full. And I've seen a lot of people, once they start to learn how to regulate their nervous system, they get into more of this relaxed state. And a lot of areas of their life start to improve: relationships, sleep, their workplace, all of their work ethic, and just how they show up for themselves and others. And then similar with TRE, or trauma and tension release exercises, that's more of like a physical somatic work, but it builds off of the idea of the neurogenic tremor. And so David Berceli, similar to how Peter Levine found this idea that animals will shake in the wild, he, when he was in the war, had seen that. His buddies and him would see that people would get blown up or something bad would happen and their system would start to shake. And he started to research this and tap into this idea. And we have learned how to be able to get into it safely now, to be able to allow it to happen, just to relieve stress. And that's why it's called trauma and tension release exercises, because a lot of people just do it for stress too. And so if you think of this idea of shaking it out, some people will call it somatic shaking. Like a really great way to do this is if you put on your favorite song and you just have a little dance party for 5 minutes and you just shake and shake and shake and have a good time. You notice that there's a physiological difference, because you move energy through your body, and it's similar. It goes through the meridian lines, which I know we talked a little bit about this idea of tapping, and tapping and TRE kind of work on the same idea, is that we have our chakras, which are our energy centers in our body that are the 7, main ones. But then you have these meridian lines that kind of go through, and you can kind of think of them in some ways as like veins or arteries, but it's for energy that moves throughout our body. And so that's like a big thing that kind of taps into that too. But TRE is a really great way for people to, once they learn how to do it, it's a set of exercises that they can learn, and either with a practitioner or there's like DVDs that you could learn this. And it's a really great way if you're nervous right before you go into a job interview or something like that, you can go in and shake it out for a moment. I had learned a similar thing called Fitzmaurice voice work when I was in the acting industry for many years. And when I was vocal coaching, it builds off the TRE principle into the first part of the voice work, which is the deconstructing part. But it's learning how to just get into that physiological tremor to alleviate stress and tension. And I would often do this. I'd go into the bathroom right before my audition. I'd go into a standing tremor, shake it out, let my breath kind of come in. And then immediately I felt way more embodied and grounded. And then I was able to go in and be super confident and then relaxed. And so that's a really great addition to do, especially before bed.
Give me an example of like, you don't have any music, or maybe you do, you can put on your phone. Like, what do we do to shake it out before bed? Because this might be a really neat, easy kind of wind down routine, or a very simple way to add to your wind down routine, just especially if you're just having a particularly crazy day. Maybe we could do something like this. This would be fun. I want to try this.
Yeah. So think of it, and I'll show a little demo here for those that are able to watch it. Think of it as like, sometimes when we feel like we overstretch, our muscles will start to shake a little bit. That's okay. Like, that's not a bad thing, right? And obviously, there are certain disorders, on the medical side of it that we always want to rule out, as far as making sure that it's not an involuntary tremor, but these are voluntary tremors that we're coming into, right? And so one of the things is you kind of want to find the sweet spot between flexion and then relaxation. And so as an example, for those that can kind of see a really great one, I'll slide my chair back here, but if I kind of put my elbows right here, and I'll kind of go from the side so you can see what I'm doing, and then I'm kind of holding my chin up. If I lift my heels up to the point of where I'm coming almost all the way up to a calf raise, and then I go all the way down, at some point through that, I might start to feel a little shake or a wobble. And then you could start to see that my elbow is starting to move a little bit like that, right? So I'll do this a little bit this way so that way you can kind of see now. But if I'm kind of here, and then I'm kind of just lifting the heels until I start to feel a little bit of a shake or a wobble, then that neurogenic tremor starts to come in. And then if I could surrender or relax into it, then I could just allow the breath to come in. So I could just breathe into, and I'm just letting the breath kind of move through. So that's one way to do it. Another way is if I stand, I can kind of start to bend at my knees a little bit, and then I might start to notice a little shake or a wobble like that. And then that's a really great one to just be able to allow it to come in. And those are like the bigger tremors. But once somebody can access the tremor mechanism, and even now I'm already feeling like, okay, my breath settled a little bit better. Like I feel like more relaxed in my chest already. So even doing it for like 30 seconds or something can be very impactful, right? But once you kind of understand how to access the tremor, then you can kind of play around with it. But it's almost like, for those at home that are listening, if you find the point of flexion where there's resistance, and then you soften out just a little bit, then that's where that tremor will start to come in. And you don't want to go all the way toward the point where you're fully extended, like in the calf raise, but oftentimes it's like just an inch or two off the ground that you'll start to feel it. One that I really love to do is when somebody's reclined on their back and they put their feet together like a little butterfly stretch, is taking their knees to kind of slowly come in, and sometimes about an inch or two from their point of where their knees are extended outwards and at external rotation. If they come in just a little bit, they'll start to feel that little wobble and shake. And then it really starts to open up the hips. And that's where we tend to store a lot of trauma, hips and shoulders for a lot of people.
I am telling you, I just experienced that. It was called Pilates class, guys. So,
yes.
And what I will tell you though is I always feel so good, right?
Yes.
And that is my way of kind of getting back into the body. It was the one thing I did when I left full-time clinical practice. I was like, I am reserving this. That was my first boundary. I need to go to Pilates class. And however you can fit it in, that's amazing. You did allude to it. We didn't talk that much about it, but I would love, because I had learned this technique.
Sure.
It was after my father passed, and it was through someone who actually is, considers herself a bit of a channeler or what have you, but she came recommended from a friend of mine, and I went to go visit her. And I was kind of going through some really difficult emotional things related to his death and my transition and everything. And it was the emotional freedom technique. And I was like, all right, I'm not even sure why I'm here, what's going to happen. She was just amazing. But that technique is something that I've really found to be helpful. Can you show a little bit of that so people kind of know what that's like? Because that's something that you don't need to be an expert at it, but I found it really therapeutic.
It is very impactful, yeah. And similar ideas. This was a modality that was created around the 1990s, and it built off of, again, the idea of the meridian system within the body. I think research and science has started to catch up with a lot of what the Eastern philosophy had known. But yeah, in the idea that we have this energy body, so it goes off of the meridian lines. And so you always want to pair like a mantra or a saying. You could think of this as like a new belief that you want to infuse. And, if we end up talking about EMDR, we'll kind of talk about what that is when we reprocess memory. But it's this idea that I'm infusing a new belief in and I'm kind of tapping it in, if you will. And it's not the same as EMDR where there's bilateral stimulation, but you're actually tapping at the meridian line. So as an example, let's say somebody is saying, I want to feel, or I am safe right now. I am here and now, right? They would start, one of the points is starting at the side of the hand. And you start to kind of tap it, and then you kind of say to yourself, I am safe. I am safe.
I'm here.
I am now, or I am here right now, right? And you say that like 2 or 3 times in that spot. And then after that, you kind of go up to your eyebrows, and then you'll start to tap there. And then you'll repeat that mantra, I am safe. I am here right now. And then you'll go to the side of the eyes, and you'll kind of tap there for a little bit. Then you'll go to the top of the lip. And then you'll kind of repeat that. Then you can go to the chin and then the collarbone. Then I often, especially for anxiety, I like to tap into the chest or the heart chakra also personally, and just kind of letting that kind of create space there too. But those are kind of the main points that you would tap into. But similar to the idea of TRE where it's moving energy, there's this idea that when I studied Fitzmaurice voice work, which like I said is very similar to TRE, but that tension in the body is just trapped energy that's craving to move, but it gets stuck, right? And this is why people who go to massages or they have like knots in their shoulders, like sometimes once that knot is released, they can have this huge emotional experience. They might have like a well of tears or something like that as well. So what the tapping starts to do is it gets into these main meridian points. And there are obviously many others as well that you can do, but it starts to move the flow of energy through your body, similar to like acupuncture. They're putting these needles in specific target points on the body that helps to let the blood flow and rush through in different ways as well.
Well, Anthony, I could talk to you for like another whole hour about this, but my producer will kick my patukas if he has to edit all of it. So we're going to wrap up, but I just wanted to say that this has been a lot of the techniques that you're using for our listeners. They need to know these are real evidence-based type of techniques. And I can tell you, having had at least some firsthand exposure, at least to emotional freedom technique. And then I didn't even know I was doing trauma and tension release exercises, but apparently Pilates is a form of that, I would argue. But one of the reasons why getting up, getting moving, what we do during the day can impact how we sleep at night. And if some of these techniques are things that you're interested in, Anthony's seeing patients. I think you're seeing patients throughout California or clients throughout California.
Yes, throughout California, virtually and in person as well.
Look for folks that are like-minded like Anthony, because it's truly a useful skill set when you learn it. And you may find that it helps you with how you approach your sleep or when you have these particular struggles. One of the biggest lessons I think I've learned on this whole journey called life is that you can't push down those emotions. I think I grew up in a household where it was like, you're too emotional. No, we don't talk about that. Like that shouldn't be a big deal. And you sort of internalize that it's somehow wrong to feel the way you feel. The bottom line is letting go of this is the right way, this is the wrong way. And I tell this all the time to folks that I'm helping with sleep. Pay attention to how you judge your behaviors and your attitudes towards sleep, because dollars to donuts, that probably applies to other aspects of your life. So this has been really one of the best sessions I've ever had in terms of talking about how the psyche meets our body and how, again, as you pointed out, there are Eastern approaches. You can marry them with Western medicine. Everything that we're talking about now, if you can kind of begin to lean in and master these psych techniques and kind of deal with what life throws you in that accumulation of trauma over the years and find healthy ways to resolve it. I see this all as being prevention, just like I see sleep as being preventative in terms of our overall health. That's what I wanted to say about this amazing episode, but I want to turn it over to you. Do you have any final words for my listeners today?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk about this, and I love being able to bring this idea in because I think psychology is starting to move into this more holistic idea of a full-bodied experience, But I think the biggest thing is just be kind to yourself. Our primary relationship is the one with ourselves, and we often forget that. And so if you can do things, and you don't have to necessarily go to a somatic therapist per se, but a great way to start is doing martial arts or doing yoga or doing Pilates, just something that gets into your body and allows you to kind of do something, that's kind of a great start. And then just trusting the process. Life is a journey, not a destination, like you said. And the more we can go with the flow, there's this idea in yoga called upeka, which is translated to this idea of trusting the flow of life. But we end up where we're meant to be. And sometimes where we want to be aligns with that. Sometimes it doesn't, but we often understand it after the fact, right? Life is about having fun. So get into your body, have fun, and, don't take things so seriously.
I love it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Struggling with sleep? Dr. Cole is here to help. Whether you need a comprehensive sleep coaching program, suspect you have sleep apnea, or simply seeking a second opinion, she's available for consultation in New Jersey, New York, California, and Georgia, with more states coming soon. Schedule your free 10-minute review of services today to find out which visit is right for you at AskTheSleepMD.com and start your journey to better sleep with a trusted sleep expert.
Please be advised that the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider for personalized guidance. For my full disclaimer, please visit AskTheSleepMD.com, and while you're there, don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter. Sweet dreams and happy listening.